Pittsburgh. I want to thank you all very much for being here. We at Sustainable Pittsburgh, along with CEOs for Sustainability and Chatham University's Falk School of Sustainability and Environment, are pleased to share with you today some hands-on resources and grounding in advancing your organization's carbon reduction goals. And we're also really pleased to hear from two panels of stellar experts today. And as many or all of you are aware by now, our discussion is especially timely in light of the latest IPCC report warning of a code red for humanity when it comes to climate. So organizations have a critical power to help mitigate the climate crisis while increasing their own resilience. So we couldn't be more pleased to be able to offer some concrete pathways today. In addition to today's presenters, we want to also thank the CEOs for Sustainability sponsors, UPMC Health Plan, Covestro LLC, and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Their generous support makes this event possible, so thank you. Just to quickly announce the agenda. First today, we have Gina Johnson, Director of Programs, and Program Manager Sarah Sangiovanni of Sustainable Pittsburgh, who will be sharing some grounding and resources to help guide your efforts. After that, we'll be pleased to host a discussion with two corporate sustainability professionals who are leading carbon reduction efforts at their companies, Jeremy Faust of Fifth Third Bank and Karen Lynn of Eaton Corporation. After that, we're excited to have Lou Leonard, Dean of Chatham University's Falk School of Sustainability and Environment, to lead an expert panel on strategies for overcoming the obstacles. With us today are Matt Banks from Guidehouse, Cynthia Cummis from World Resources Institute, David Gardner and Associates, Jenna Lake, 3R Sustainability, and Eric Olson, most recently at BSR. A few housekeeping notes for today's event. We will be recording this webinar. We already are. And as we hear from today's presenters, we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A box. We've got a lot to go through, so we want to make sure to get as many questions in that format as we can. And with that, I'll just say again, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing to achieve this very important goal of carbon reduction. And I will hand it over to Gina to get us started.
Thanks, Joylette. Really pleased to be with everybody today. Thanks so much for your time and all of the great panelists who are with us today. We're going to start with a little bit of grounding to lay the groundwork for a robust discussion among these panelists. We're going to quickly walk through the high-level activities of an effective climate-focused operation strategy. So as you can see here, it's important to start with a good understanding of the company's climate impacts, risks, and opportunities. Developing an effective climate strategy starts with defining your purpose and ambition and any reduction targets. When it comes to implementation and embedding the strategy, that includes identifying and assessing your strategic options, things like optimizing your operations, reducing the emissions of your products and services, and transforming your supply chain. And finally, you'll want to communicate progress in the depth required by your stakeholders to fully and transparently evaluate your climate performance. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into these quickly. Understanding your climate impact includes mapping your value chain and carbon footprint, including upstream and downstream activities to the greatest extent possible. Companies tend to start by focusing on scope 1 and 2, the emissions they have the most control over naturally. Scope 3 includes all the indirect emissions that occur within an organization's wider value chain, including in the usage of your product and services by your customers. Of course, that tends to be the most difficult in terms of accurate data collection and the ability to control those emissions. But scope 3 is also where companies generally have the greatest source of emissions. So it's critically important to include. You also might be hearing about scope 4 emissions, typically described as avoided emissions. A major piece of scope 4 is CO2 emissions avoided by employees who work from home. Reporting initiatives like the Science Based Targets Initiative and the CDP don't require you to report on avoided emissions, but accounting for scope 4 is important to achieving a holistic view of the organization's carbon footprint. Some more organizations are looking at doing that. For instance, when a company has increased emissions in the short term to develop a new manufacturing process to improve product efficiency in the long run, it's important to kind of see that implication over time. When it comes to understanding your organization's risks and opportunities, The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures outlines one approach. In case you're not familiar with it, the TCFD framework is a set of recommendations to help organizations more effectively disclose climate-related risks and opportunities through their existing reporting processes. We'll come back to that. But here, risks are defined as either transition risks created by the world's transition to a low-carbon economy as a result of carbon policy changes, or physical risks created from a changing climate. So transition risks are things like policy and legal risk, technology, and market risks, as well as reputational risk. Physical risks include extreme weather events and long-term changes in weather patterns. On the opportunity side, we see more efficient use of resources, use of lower emission energy sources, development of or expansion of your low emission goods and services, access to markets and other resiliency efforts. These opportunities present strategic options for your operations, as well as your whole supply chain. Central to developing an organizational carbon reduction strategy, of course, is establishing your goals. And goals tend to fall into three main categories. Carbon neutral covers CO2 emissions only. They're very flexible about what the scope of activities included. They use a mix of abatement and compensation activities, and they may rely heavily on compensation over abatement. Net zero covers all of your greenhouse gas emissions. It allows compensation activities, but they're typically under specified parameters. It may include some scope 3. And at this point, we're getting more sophisticated about how they're approached. Now, science-based targets are focused on reducing emissions associated with the company's activities. Just a handful of companies in our region have set an SBT, including one of them is Eaton Corporation with us here today. These are in line with the Paris Agreement reduction scenarios and includes scope 3 if those represent 40% of the organization's total emissions. It's interesting or important to note that as of July 2022, the minimum ambition for target setting is set to increase from well below 2 degrees Celsius to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. When it comes to communicating the organization's approach and performance over time, two voluntary climate risk disclosure tools rise to the top. Mentioned TCFD. It was introduced in 2017 and it quickly gained traction with large publicly traded companies. This was driven by investor pressure and regulatory mandates in an increasing number of countries. Also, the fact that the annual CDP questionnaire now incorporates TCFD recommendations. As you can see here, in 2019, 2,508 companies worldwide responded to the CDP's climate change information requests, and 69% of them disclosed information on at least 80% of the recommended TCFD disclosures. We expect the uptake to only increase based on increasing pressure from investors and the likelihood of mandatory climate risk assessment and disclosure here in the United States as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Sarah to share some resources for progress.
Hi, everyone. So Sustainable Pittsburgh's mission is to empower decision-making that builds a fundamentally equitable, resilient, healthy, and prosperous region. So we offer a suite of performance programs for workplaces and for municipalities to advance sustainability practices, including carbon reduction, of course. So as you can see across the top of the slide here, these include designation programs for small retail shops, for restaurants, and for Pennsylvania municipalities. And throughout any of these programs, an organization can follow a framework to access resources and take step-by-step actions in areas like workplace equity and energy and water savings to earn a designation in bronze, silver, gold, or platinum. So this fall, we're also launching a new program called the Sustainable Pittsburgh Workplace Designation, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. To help participants in these programs move towards measurable impact, Sustainable Pittsburgh also offers toolkits and soon to come sprints, which will be friendly competitions that will run for 3 to 6 months and focus on a single topic of importance, such as carbon reduction or workplace equity. So finally, to support the professionals involved in all of this work, we host 2 professional networks, the CEOs for Sustainability, which is led by the region's business leaders, and the Sustainable Community Development Network for elected leaders and staff at municipalities, and that's statewide. So one of our tools that you can start using today is the Leading Forward Roadmap. This is a resource that the CEOs for Sustainability and Sustainable Pittsburgh developed last fall to develop a set of priorities that the CEOs for Sustainability have established to support a sustainable economic recovery. So specifically, the CEOs for Sustainability challenged the region's workplaces to support local businesses and communities, to advance racial and ethnic equity, and to reduce carbon emissions. And the roadmap is designed to provide a strategic framework for business action in those 3 priority areas. So you can access that for free right now at the URL that's shown right here. So for each of those 3 priority areas, the roadmap contains strategic steps, customizable tools, and it also has a source library to support action. So this is a screenshot that shows these initial steps in that reducing carbon emissions section. And we created this with guidance from the region's sustainability professionals, as well as our university and nonprofit partners. So to give you a little bit more of a sense of the new workplace designation, we're expecting this program and the sprints to comprise a more user-friendly, materiality-based, and impactful evolution of the Sustainable Pittsburgh Challenge, in which so many of your companies participated over the years. Something that's really unique and distinctive about the workplace program is the strategic sustainability section within it, which is designed to walk participants through identifying the sustainability issues that are most material to their organization, making a plan for addressing those issues, and integrating that plan into the organization's strategy. And then, as you can see here on the slide, each of the remaining impact-focused topics included in the program encourage users to conduct an assessment of current performance in those areas, to set goals and KPIs, take action, and then communicate their results. So thinking about carbon reduction specifically, 4 of these topics in particular really touch on that. So in the greenhouse gas section focuses primarily on assessing emissions. The energy management section really focuses on reducing carbon-based energy use via increasing efficiency and transitioning to renewable energy. The transportation section really focuses on business travel, commutes, and sustainable fleets as major themes. And then finally, in the responsible products and services section, there are actions related to supplier engagement and the circular economy. So just taking a closer look at the energy management category as an example, you can see that across all of these different topics that we just covered, the criteria really build upon each other to provide a pathway for progress. So this allows participants at any level of sustainability progress and organizations that own their own space or rent their space or work virtually to earn points for the actions they've taken and consider steps for continuing achievement. We can go to the next slide. Sorry, one more back. Thank you. I really hope that you'll take the next steps to get started with Sustainable Pittsburgh carbon reduction resources with us. Please access the Leading Forward Roadmap, plan to participate in the new designation program in the sprints, attend upcoming events. You can stay apprised of all of these opportunities by subscribing to our newsletter. The link for that is listed on this slide. So now I'll turn it over to Gina to introduce our first set of panelists.
Thanks, Sarah. Now we're going to spend some time with executives who are leading ambitious carbon reduction efforts at their companies. I'm so pleased to welcome Jeremy Faust, Environmental Sustainability Leader at Fifth Third Bank, and Karen Lynn, Vice President of Corporate EHS Programs and Sustainability at Eaton Corporation. You can find full bios for each of these panelists online at the link in the chat. Each of these executives has been invited to provide an overview of what advancing carbon reduction looks like at their very different businesses. And then we look forward to a fascinating discussion and your questions. Throughout the session, we invite you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions for the panelists. So let's get started. Take it away, Jeremy.
Thank you, Gina, and great to be with you all. As noted, I'm Jeremy Faust. I'm the Environmental Sustainability Leader with Fifth Third Bank. Hopefully everyone's familiar with Fifth Third, but for those who don't know us, we're one of the largest money managers in the Midwest. We operate over 1,000 full-service banking centers across our footprint. My primary focus at the bank is developing and implementing a set of operational sustainability goals across our enterprise. I also support the development of our climate strategy as co-chair of Fifth Third's Sustainable Financing and Climate Strategy Council, and increasingly spend a lot of time reporting and supporting our ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks. A lot more reporting every year, and that job just continues to grow. My background includes more than a decade of environmental sustainability work across governments, nonprofit organizations, and for-profit organizations as well. You know, over the past few years, Fifth Third has begun purchasing 100% renewable power. We've set an $8 billion sustainable financing goal, and we've achieved carbon neutrality for our operations. And there is plenty left to do. So again, excited to be talking with the group and looking forward to sharing more about the journey. In doing so, you know, it's always, I feel like sounds good when we're highlighting what we've achieved over the past years. But no, you know, there's plenty of challenges, there's plenty of hurdles that we've gone through along the way, probably many of the same challenges that your organizations are facing today. We've had a lot of help from you know, peers and guidance from other leaders in the industry, and certainly welcome the questions and outreach that any of you may seek going forward. So when it comes to providing insight about our carbon journey, I think it's important to kind of touch on our stakeholder groups. You know, our customers, our employees, the local communities in which we work, and certainly the shareholders, all have a growing set of expectations. All are becoming, you know, more vocal about what they expect from everyone, but certainly from us as an organization. So we're responding to those growing expectations and trying to meet the expectations of all those different stakeholder groups. And shareholders are, you know, among those that have gotten a tremendous amount of attention as their voices have gotten louder. They all seem to be talking a lot now about climate risk issues and carbon emissions issues, and become really a major voice in this space that are prodding us and all of our peers forward. And I think, you know, rightly so, as they recognize that climate change is a major driver of future risk, as well as future success for the organizations that they're investing in. So they want to make sure that we're all kind of planning, accounting for those things and being good corporate citizens along the way. There's also this, you know, robust reporting ecosystem that's developed, this network of organizations that are, you know, tracking and evaluating and scoring and ultimately publicly reporting on how we perform as an organization around each of these different issues. So whether it's, you know, CDP and TCFD, as Gina referenced, or, you know, SASB and GRI, there's just a lot more transparency across the industry than there ever has been before. And as a result, we need to be proactive and engage these issues and engage them successfully to make true progress in what we're doing. Our journey started, I think, in earnest around 2017 when we set our first set of operational sustainability goals. Gina, as you jump to the next slide here, you'll see a little bit about our performance, but we essentially made our first public commitments to achieve 25% reductions in our energy and greenhouse gas emissions, 20% reductions in our water use and waste, and a 100% renewable power goal. Really based on where we saw our peers and wanting to be a leader and kind of push forward in this space. You know, to date, we've been able to accomplish 3 of these goals, but again, our peers continue to push for more, our stakeholders continue to push for more, and as a result, we need to continue to kind of move forward and enhance what we do. The next slide, you'll see a quick graphic on, I think, one of our bigger achievements. You know, our 100% renewable power goal was probably the biggest that we set for ourselves back in 2017. We wanted to do that to account for the total power usage at, you know, 1,000+ banking centers, our ATM machines, our commercial offices, et cetera. And we saw the virtual power purchase agreement. Some of you may be familiar with PPAs, but we saw that as a viable vehicle to kind of get to that 100% commitment that we had made for ourselves. So we spent a couple years doing a lot of due diligence, kind of navigating the industry. Obviously hadn't done this before, so it was very much a new enterprise to try to understand how to make this bold leap, but ended up being a really positive experience for us. and brought in a broad coalition of folks across our organization that historically had never been, proactively involved in our sustainability work, but our investor relations team, our legal team, our treasury, our finance, all kind of sitting around the table talking about this big visionary project that we were trying to undertake, and really created a foundation for us to handle all the issues I think that we've been able to manage and work through since that time. In 2019, the project that you see here came online. This is about an 80 megawatt solar project down in North Carolina, and was really developed because we made a commitment to purchase the power from this project. And as a result, the developer was able to get this financed and built. So we feel very good about this as a key component. And we're the first Fortune 500 company to contract for 100% renewable power through a single project. So that was exciting for the team, all these stakeholders kind of coming together around the table for the first time to take on something kind of bold, but just was a lot of excitement and really a great response from the public in achieving this, that I think created an impetus for our team to kind of continue to move forward and think about what we could accomplish next. It also put us in a position to start thinking about carbon offsets. Fast forward to 2020, this project is up and running. We have this kind of entirety of our electric emissions are now offset by renewable power. So we start to look at the remaining emissions that we have from natural gas, from transport, and it's really a limited amount of emissions that are left, considering the large portion that we offset from an electric standpoint. So put us in a position to begin evaluating the voluntary carbon offset market. There's a little bit of controversy there. Some folks are reluctant to purchase offsets because they feel like that's not fully committing to reducing emissions. But we saw this as part of a larger package of activities that we were undertaking as an organization. We knew we had done this large solar project. We knew we were going to continue to do energy efficiency work across our enterprise, but thought this would be something exciting for our stakeholders to be proud of again. So just last year, we purchased our first set of carbon offsets. We did this from a project that was kind of within one of the states that we operate. So there was a converted biofuels project in Louisville, Kentucky, that we're purchasing offsets from. But again, another kind of milestone for us, and became the first regional commercial bank to achieve the carbon neutrality achievement that we undertook. So this accounts for our Scope 1 emissions, our Scope 2 emissions, as well as our Scope 3 business travel emissions. So again, every time we kind of accomplish a goal, we celebrate a bit, but also recognize there's a lot left to do. The next slide, I think, starts to jump into some of the pillars of our sustainability work, just to kind of round out how we think about this and in the work that we're doing. Beyond those operational elements, we've also had increased focus on environmental risk management. We're also working to accelerate a transition to a sustainable future for a lot of the stakeholders that we're working with, our customers, those local communities, and our employees. But chief among those has been an effort to enhance our sustainable financing activities. As the industry itself has grown, we've had the opportunity to do more sustainable financing work, primarily around renewable energy. And in the process, set for ourselves an $8 billion sustainable financing goal to complete by 2025. So again, we're kind of riding the wave of renewable energy growth, but it offers an opportunity for us to put another kind of post out there and say, all right, this is what we want to do over the coming years, and we're going to make sure that we've got the buy-in across the organization to achieve another bold goal. And then the other element mentioned is risk management, really focused around climate risk. It is probably the fastest growing of these areas, as the stakeholders that we're working with, and in particular the shareholder groups, are really focused on how we, and certainly all of our peers, but how we're dealing with climate risk, how we're thinking about it, how we're preparing for it, what we're accounting for across our organization, and how we're starting to adjust to those things. So as Gina talks about CDP and TCFD, those are critical reporting frameworks for us now that focus a lot of their attention on climate risk issues. And just the, going through the process of some of those surveys, answering those questions, it really begins to focus our attention on what's most important. We see how our peers are responding, so we understand kind of how to benchmark ourselves against our peers, but ultimately understand that there's opportunities for improvement. And even though they're challenging and it requires a lot of extra time to kind of answer these surveys and questions and everything, I really do think it's helped us along the journey, focusing our attention where we needed to focus it. The last slide here, just a reminder about one other group and one other acronym to throw at you. The Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, is kind of the next big thing in our industry. It's focusing attention for banks and other lending institutions on how we're going to measure and report on emissions associated with our lending or financing activity. And for a bank, as you can imagine, that is our core service. That's where so much of our emissions impact is kind of tied into. It's the Scope 3 emissions, so it's taken us a little bit longer to kind of get there, but we recognize that there's a big opportunity and are now on the journey as a member of PCAF to figure out how we're going to measure these things, how we're going to account for these emissions, and then ultimately how we're going to start to bend that curve and reduce these emissions. So you can start to envision a future not far off where banks have a ranking or score around their financing portfolio and the emissions associated with that financing activity. So anyway, it's just a brief snapshot of some of the work that we're doing. Happy to answer questions as we move forward. And of course, feel free to reach out if there's anything we can help with.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great in-depth kind of look in the very little bit of time we had, so thank you. I want to welcome Karen to share with us some of the work that Eaton's been doing. Lots of leadership there on carbon emissions reduction as well. Karen?
Thank you, Gina. I've got more slides, but I'm gonna go through them pretty quickly. So let's get started. I appreciate the opportunity to join. For those of you who aren't familiar with Eaton, we are a power management company, and that takes a variety of different forms: electrical, mechanical, hydraulic, lots of different types of power. And as you can imagine, change situation that we're facing, especially as was mentioned with the new IPCC report that came out on Monday. Managing power is front and center in everybody's mind. Next slide, please. Just want to kind of ground everybody on where we're located. We have several hundred manufacturing and support organizations around the world. And although it's not on this map, I will say that our location in Pittsburgh is the headquarters for our electrical sector. Next slide, please. Our electrical sector represents a very large portion of our portfolio. And that portfolio consists of power distribution equipment, power quality equipment, which is very integral to the growing digital environment, data centers, et cetera, and a variety of other electrical support, monitoring, and management solutions. We also have a business, an industrial business focused on aerospace, vehicle, and e-mobility. We recently just sold our hydraulics operations to Danfoss, and we're currently growing what we would call e-mobility across a variety of different platforms, whether that's vehicles or airplanes. Next slide, please. Okay, I wanted to just communicate to everyone what the core mission is of the company. And as someone who has been working in the sustainability field for many years, I was really excited when the company articulated their core mission, which is stated here. Our mission as Eaton is to improve the quality of life and the environment through the use of power management technologies and services. We also communicated through a series of aspirational goals our commitment to our workforce, the safety, health, and wellness of our employees, our suppliers, our dedication to making work exciting and meaningful, being a model of inclusion and diversity, making our communities stronger, and then being active stewards of the environment. At the same time, delivering superior returns to our shareholders and fulfilling our broader obligations to society. So all of this is very exciting when one works in the sustainability and ESG area. Next slide. I do want to point out just briefly that the sustainability journey that Eaton has been on has not been just a recent one. Eaton is a company that goes back to the early 1900s. And as far back as 1916, we had waste segregation and recycling, beneficial use programs, etc. For many years now, Eaton has supported the science of climate change and really embraced our role in that space. I also want to point out that our reporting, both Gina and Jeremy discussed this whole world of disclosure that we're facing. And we started a lot of our disclosure as a company in 2006 with an annual report that contained both the typical business and financial information, but also our sustainability performance. We're very pleased with that integrated type of approach. However, with the increased demand in transparency and really overall requests for public information, we chose in 2019 to move away from that, and we published a standalone sustainability report, 60+ pages, with a great deal of information. We've also been disclosing our performance on climate action through CDP since 2006. And the same thing with our public goals around greenhouse gas, water, and waste. We've been publishing those goals and our performance also since 2006. Then last year, 2020, I guess looking back in hindsight, it wasn't unusual, but we were in the midst of a pandemic in 2020, and a lot of people were very focused on that. And yet, mid-year is when our leadership chose to announce very aggressive 2030 sustainability goals. Next slide, please. Okay, and I want to put those goals in perspective. I'm not going to go through all of them, but our goals fall into 4 categories that really support our whole sustainability strategy. And that strategy focuses on sustainable solutions for our customers, reducing our overall footprint, engaging our employees in our communities, and then what we would call doing business right, which includes a lot of our governance activities, reporting, transparency, and so on. I'll draw your attention to a couple. Under reducing footprint, we've taken on 2 goals. One is a science-based target, which includes a 50% reduction in carbon emissions from our manufacturing operations, and actually not just manufacturing, but overall operations, and also a 15% reduction in our Scope 3 emissions. Alongside that, we've taken on the aggressive target of being carbon neutral by 2030. For those of you that may think those are kind of opposed to each other, they're really not. They're very complementary goals. Our objective is to be carbon neutral by 2030. That objective may require us to engage in the purchase of certain offsets, which are not allowed under the science-based target. But all in all, very aggressive goals, and we're working diligently to get there. Next slide, please. Okay, just very quickly, I wanted to point out that our leadership has also signed on, our CEO specifically, to the Business Roundtable statement of the purpose of a corporation. And I think this public statement was very important to further show our overall commitment to sustainability values. And you can see here the things that our Business Roundtable 181 CEOs thought was important around the purpose of a corporation. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to go through all this either, just in the interest of time, but did want to point out that our goals and what we're doing as a company aligns very well to the established UN Sustainable Development Goals. Climate change is critical to that. Good health, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work, economic growth, and so on. So we've mapped our goals and our sustainability strategy to very, very clearly to 10 of the 17 SDGs. Next. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to point out that this year was a big year for us. We expanded a lot of our, some of our reporting in the sustainability report, which was put out in June. And at the same time, we published our first TCFD report. Gina mentioned the TCFD, and so did Jeremy. And that was a really fascinating and challenging undertaking to go through climate scenarios, look at transitional risk as well as physical risk, and get input from all the different functions of businesses within our company to really capture those risks and opportunities and publish them. We think it was a good effort, and we will be looking forward to improving on that report, and hopefully that will position us well for what we think is additional regulation in this space, both in Europe and in the US, in terms of publishing climate-related risk. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. That was great. I'm going to turn off the slides here so we can chat and invite Jeremy back. I appreciate you both going into as much depth as we could in a little bit of time that we tried to pack a lot of great information into. One thing that occurs is that your organizations are such leaders, not just in the goals that we can look at, we see in the news headlines, but you've clearly embedded a focus on climate response into your operations and the way that you view opportunities and risk across the business, to all the way to the extent that it's part of your business model. With it's obviously very clearly the tie to Eaton's work related to helping organizations reduce their emissions, but even with the bank Fifth Third work to create a sustainable finance goal of $8 billion. So I wondered if we could just start with asking you, how do you go about embedding a climate action focus across the business, especially maybe for a company that might not be nearly as far along as you are?
Well, I'll jump in here. I think this process all evolves over time, and I love, Gina, that you guys are trying to help outline for organizations kind of what that path looks like. There's things that we talk about today that we absolutely could not have done even 3 years ago. We just weren't in the same place as we are today as an organization. You've got to go through some of those tough challenges. You've got to, develop some of those wins in order to have the more ambitious conversations. As I noted, we're also just getting a lot of pressure from third parties about what they expect us to do. So as they ask the right questions, we dig further into our business model, we dig into our opportunity, and a lot of time spent just looking at what is our environmental / carbon / sustainability impact. Where do we have opportunities to make a big difference? I don't want to spend as much of my limited time on the things that aren't going to have that impact. So you focus on the areas where you can make the biggest difference. And obviously for a bank, the brass ring is how do we get into green sustainable financing opportunities? How do we look at reducing the emissions of our lending portfolio? That way is much, much, much bigger than what we could even do with our core operations. So we know that's where our attention needs to be going forward. We're putting more focus on it. We're still in the early stages of it, but I think in the years ahead, that's increasingly what we'll be talking about.
Karen, do you want to add to that?
Sure, I'll add to that. Maybe a little bit different spin. For years, because of the business that we're in, Eaton has connected what we do to sustainability in a certain way. However, I can't say that it's always been operationalized. I'll just be honest about that. Our businesses think a lot about what their customers want, and they think of that in terms of quality, delivery, price, performance, and to some degree they may bring in sustainability, but not always. And so we've really elevated over the years the dialogue around climate change, and dialogue around our product portfolios has really elevated, especially with our science-based target addressing Scope 3 emissions. Just that whole aspect of our emissions in use and our supply chain has really further engaged the organization in discussions that maybe they weren't having before. The science-based target and our carbon neutral goals have also really motivated our operations to really pay attention to some things that maybe they thought they were paying attention to, but realized that, wow, carbon neutral is really, really a tall order. And there's a whole lot more to be done than just, energy efficiency year over year. It's a monumental change to decarbonize your fossil fuels, or your fuel sources. Taking on the targets and having our leadership talk about the importance of those targets and the value to our business long term has really been critical to getting our operations and entire company engaged around the topic.
I appreciate that. And, to that point, you mentioned leadership from the top being just as important maybe as the stakeholder pressures that Jeremy outlined so beautifully that are impacting all companies, whether they're publicly traded or not to some extent. We're really happy that your organization is part of CEOs for Sustainability. And appreciate you both being here today to share your journey and provide such a great example for so many companies that are looking to just get going or make progress further along the line. I'm sorry that we don't have time for more questions today, but thank you so much for being with us, and we're going to move on to the next panel at this time. Once again, thanking Jeremy and Karen for being with us. With that, I'm going to turn over the conversation to Lou Leonard, Dean of the Fox School of Sustainability and Environment at Chatham University. And take it away there, Lou.
Great, thank you, Gina, and thanks everybody for being here today. What a great panel that was, and an excellent event today overall. And as Joylette said at the outset, and others have mentioned, today's discussion comes at such an important moment. Our sustainability challenges with climate disruption at the leading edge, they've never been clearer, they've never been more pressing. And really, while politicians still struggle to meet this moment, I believe that some of the clearest leadership is in the private sector. Thousands of companies are setting science-based targets and net zero goals. New trade associations are emerging in this space. B2B initiatives where companies support each other in this work are becoming more common. Now, I could understand you might say, okay, big ambitious goals, they may be powerful, they're definitely needed, but they don't mean much, do they, if we can't meet them? Or if the prospect of a net zero gold standard scares off medium-sized companies from trying to get in the game. And I see you in the back row thinking, but wait, I'm still trying to get my first GHG inventory out the door. Am I in the right place? Should I even be trying to catch up at this point? And the answer is yes, you are. You're in the right place here today. You're in the right work. And this panel that we're about to do is entirely built around answering your questions. We have a big panel, so the way we did it is we polled you ahead of time for questions, and now we're going to dig into the mailbag and start chewing on them. But who's we? Well, frankly, the group that we have here today is so impressive from my perspective that I really can't do justice to their bios now, and we're not going to let them talk about themselves. So you really should read more about them at the link that has been provided for looking at the background of our panelists. But let me give a real short version, again, because they're not allowed to. First, David Gartner and his firm. For my money, they're the smarts and the muscle behind a lot of major corporate climate initiatives like the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, which just received a national award from the MacArthur Foundation. Previously, David was the executive director of the White House Task Force on Climate Change and also has been an assistant administrator at the US EPA. Cynthia Cummins is here. She's at the heart of the World Resources Institute Climate and Business team, has been for a while. She's one of the co-founders and lots of the elbow grease behind the Science Based Targets Initiative, which now has over 1,600 companies committed to its very sophisticated framework, including ones we heard from today. She also helped create US EPA's first program to engage with companies on carbon reduction. Eric Olson is here today. This summer, he stepped away from a long run as Senior Vice President at Business for Social Responsibility, BSR, where he specialized in corporate supply chains, among other things. Both Eric and I were co-founders of the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, a new corporate trade association, now with hundreds of members who are helping each other scale up renewable energy procurement. Most of you from the Pittsburgh area likely already know Jana Lake. She's such a mainstay in this region, helping companies develop emissions inventories, set net zero carbon goals, and create the action plans that are needed to deliver on them. She also really supports our community in other deep ways, including her work as a mentor for young sustainability professionals, something that's really close to my heart, for which she was given a SHERO Award in 2020 by the US Green Building Council. And then Matt Banks. You might not know Matt Banks at the global sustainability consulting firm Guidehouse, but you should, because he's been behind some of the biggest corporate climate initiatives that have ever been created, like Climate Savers and Science Based Targets. And just this year, he did it again, launching a new partnership with over 150 supplier companies who are now faced with meeting the bold climate goals set, those supply chain goals set by companies like Mars and PepsiCo. And I'm Lou Leonard, still mostly the new dean of the Chatham Falk School of Sustainability and Environment. I used to run with most of these amazing people doing similar work. I now spend much of my time up here at Eden Hall, the first campus built from the ground up to be sustainable, LEED Platinum buildings, 2 microgrids, an organic farm, deep work at the crossroads of sustainability and food. And at Falk, we use almost an entirely experience-based learning approach, including working with companies on wicked sustainability problems to turn out professionally focused undergrads and master students who are ready for work. So speaking of work, let's get to it, shall we? Can we, do we have all of our panelists up and visible? Okay, excellent. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the virtual space here. Thanks for being with us. Jana, can I start with you? So often sustainability reporting can be a gateway for companies towards deeper action. We already heard from Jeremy and Gina talk about this a little bit, this growing menu of reporting frameworks. How should a company navigate these choices?
Well, thank you, Lou, and what a great panel. And that earlier discussion, Gina, thank you so much. It was really, it's always helpful to be able to see how others have approached this. We often are on the point of getting the phone calls from companies that say, I need help to create a sustainability report, or my customer asked me to report to EcoVadis or to CDP, where do I start? And the first thing I always say is, do you know what you are reporting on? Sustainability can be such a very broad topic. And one of the things that they really need to do first is determine what are their most material impact areas. Gina laid that out very nicely with Sarah as well, talking about kind of how do you get started. You could report on so many things, but starting with what's most impactful and material to your business is the right way to start. And frankly, climate has become a material topic for everyone because it impacts every business in one way or another. From the risks that we were talking about earlier around climate change within their own facilities, the risks within the supply chain. So for each material topic, a company needs to kind of first understand is my performance right now? What is my baseline? Where am I starting? And then they need to start to figure out, okay, what are some realistic goals that I can use for improvement? And they need to start putting in place their plan to achieve those goals. So when it comes to climate and carbon reduction, the first thing you want to do is reduce your energy usage, right? Then you start to figure out, okay, how do I engage renewables within my portfolio? What is the role of offsets? But reporting becomes that way to communicate those goals and those efforts in a way that's relevant to others. And it starts to demonstrate progress. But the real value is what the company does with the information then to continue to monitor their progress and drive for continual improvement. But sustainability reporting is a way for communication and accountability between the different stakeholders. So for an organization to communicate their goals and their progress, their customers want to know how, in fact, they're aligning to their business and how they're supporting their goals. And by reporting, you're starting to now provide some of that insight into your customers' Scope 3 emissions. They're starting to, communicate with suppliers around this is now what's, expected from you for me to be able to meet my goals. It's about communicating these commitments and goals to investors, to consumers who are really starting to care about the products that they're buying, and to their employees to make sure that they can attract and retain talent. So all of these stakeholders care about sustainability. The reporting is becoming a way to be able to try to standardize more how they're reporting with each other. So, what we've really found is if you start with what's most material to your business and you think about where do I stand right now and what great things am I already doing, you can start your journey first with defining what your impacts are in a balanced way and communicating those, and then starting to move toward the frameworks such as CDP, TCFD, others you heard Jeremy talk about, SASB and GRI are great ways to start getting some common language and common disclosures so that we can actually drive for some comparison across companies and be able to get that visibility from Scope 1 through 3. And that's what's needed to be able to set things like the net zero and the science-based targets, is having that visibility in your own operations and throughout your entire supply chain.
Thanks, Jenna, that's really great. When a company comes and asks you, wait a minute, there's these different reporting sort of frameworks and this alphabet soup of reporting, what do you tell them in terms of kind of where to start on that kind of menu of reporting platform?
Absolutely. I think the first thing they need to do is be very real about what's important to their business, and then say within their industry analysis, understand what your competitors, your customers, and your suppliers are currently reporting to. Public companies are going to very consistently be asked to report to SASB. There needs to be a way to be able to compare across those from an investor portfolio standpoint. GRI is a very nice way to be able to report because it gives you more than just the numbers from a performance standpoint. It gives you that opportunity to explain a management approach. And that's really what a company needs to be driving for, is how am I in fact managing that and how do I communicate that to others? So the balance of the GRI and SASB are two really nice tools. And we frequently suggest that people first understand what you're reporting on. Secondly, make sure that you're driving toward the SASB and GRI for your basic sustainability reporting. When it comes to climate, though, you really need to go to that CDP and TCFD level, because that's where we're now starting to aggregate this information so that we can look across and down and have that full picture of what a company's scope 1 through 3 encompasses.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. So Cynthia, can you say a little bit more about this trend towards net zero or carbon neutrality targets? We heard Karen mention this, that Eden has both. Can you talk about how these net zero goals relate to this, to the trend towards science-based targets? Like how does it all come together for a company?
Okay, hi everyone. So yeah, so net zero, as you've seen, has really become the global goal that countries, companies, lots of different actors are aiming for. But we first need clarity on what net zero really means, right? So, well, it's more clear maybe at a global level what it means. You have to understand, you have to translate that down to a company. And that's where I think there's a lot of confusion right now. And if you look in the media, there's a lot of criticism of these targets because companies are translating that definition in different ways and have a whole range of strategies to meet them, some more credible than others. But first I'd say these are long-term targets that you're aiming for. And that, well, that's laudable, and companies should be thinking this long-term vision. They need to think about how they're going to transition to net zero. It's a pretty empty target without a more near-term target. So while that's great to aim for net zero, what companies really should be focusing on is how do they get on the path to net zero and setting a credible target to get them on the path. I want to mention that the Science Based Targets Initiative has been working for 2 years now to try to provide this clarity on what net zero means for a company. And we're well into developing a standard for net zero target setting that will be launching in just a few months at COP. And then we'll start validating these longer term net zero targets in addition to the near term targets. And you can't get a long-term target validated without a near-term SBT. And the way we've been defining net zero for companies is reducing emissions in line with a 1.5 trajectory, and then balancing any type of residual emissions that you may have at the state of net zero with carbon removals. And for most companies, that means reducing emissions by 90 to 95% from around a 2010 or later base year by 2050 or earlier. But the most important thing, as I said, is just getting on this path to net zero and setting a 1.5 aligned science-based target. So I think while net zero is this global goal that everyone's paying attention to, it's more critical to focus on these more near-term targets to immediately get on track to reducing in line with 1.5.
Right. So the SBTs can get you on a authentic and credible path, in the near term, and then that longer lodestar can help, catalyze some of those, deeper conversations like Jeremy was talking about, oh, geez, like if we were to get to zero, like what does that really mean? But we've got that pathway anchored in the early years with an SBT.
Exactly.
David, just wanted to sort of bring you into this, if you want to say, anything else about these net zero or carbon neutrality targets.
Great, thank you, Lou, and thanks to you and Sustainable Pittsburgh. It's great to be a part of this event. I would say, first of all, that Cynthia is absolutely right. These longer term science-based targets are in fact where we are. That's such a big shift from where things started, let's say a decade or more ago in terms of target setting. I think then people were thinking short term. What can I accomplish in the next few years, maybe 5, maybe 10? and a lot of focus on renewable electricity. So this shift in the way that Cynthia described it over to this much more comprehensive planning, both long and short term, I think has got particularly companies moving in two interesting directions. Number one, I think we're seeing the identification of a lot more parts of the climate puzzle that need solutions. So you mentioned this work that we're doing on renewable thermal energy. This grew out of some work we were doing a number of years ago with companies on renewable electricity. But these manufacturers came and said to us, hey, love that renewable electricity stuff, but our heating and cooling needs in the manufacturing process are much bigger, and we need to do something about it. Similarly, I think we're seeing a lot of work now, particularly focused on transportation. What are we going to do to electrify fleets of vehicles, whether they're trucking fleets like retailers and UPS and FedEx run, or fleets that may be passenger vehicles. So new and different issue areas. And then the second thing that I think we're seeing, which is really important, is companies and other institutions working together. We formed this Renewable Thermal Collaborative because all of these institutions who were involved in it realized they couldn't solve this problem on their own, and that they would benefit by working with others. And so now it's companies, it's city governments, including, I'm happy to say, the city of Pittsburgh. It's universities like the University of California system, it's hospitals. So working together to solve these problems is a thing, I think, that is an outgrowth of this change in the way that people are looking at the climate target setting and implementation planning.
That's great. Thank you, David. And so, Cynthia, I want to go back to you briefly as we kind of transition to another aspect of this, the implications of these platforms like the Science Based Targets Initiative. And it was already just sort of mentioned earlier, the requirement that the SBTI has for Scope 3 targets. So if we think back to the beginning of these, David brought us back a little bit, kind of in time, we think back at the beginning of some of these aggressive target setting initiatives, there really were these bigger companies that led the way. They had more capacity internally to take on some of these issues. But as we see this trend, especially towards Scope 3 targets, how should small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, what does this mean for companies like that with less capacity to devote to this work? How are they engaging with these platforms? What are the implications for them? Can you just kick us off in that direction, and then we'll bring a couple of other folks in as well.
Yeah, I would just start with saying like that. Yeah, I agree with what Jana was talking about with her approach, where companies should do a materiality assessment, decide which issues are material for them and focus on those. And I'd say for all companies, climate is material. That just goes without saying. Every single company needs to be setting a science-based target across Scope 1, 2, and 3, and aiming for net zero. But of course, for a small and medium-sized company, they may not have the resources to do it on their own. One thing the Science Based Target Initiative has done is we have like a streamlined approach to make it easier for small and medium-sized companies to participate. So if you have less than 500 employees, you can do a much more streamlined approach where we just give very limited options for how you set a target to make it easy to decide what target you have, and then a very streamlined approach to get it validated, and very minimal cost to get it validated. And the most important thing is that the focus is all on Scope 1 and 2, and we just recommend that you small companies look to reduce Scope 3 emissions, but we don't make that a requirement like we do for the larger companies. So I think we're enabling a more phased in approach for these smaller companies. I think it's the same thing large companies have done. They've just been started earlier, so they've had more time to phase in their action. And small, medium-sized companies just need to go on the same trajectory where you focus on your operations first and get your own house in order. And then once you have a handle on that, then you can start thinking about Scope 3. And then maybe you just think about your most material categories of Scope 3 emissions first before you can have a more comprehensive approach. And now that probably your largest customers are asking for you to reduce your emissions because they have scope 3 targets and they need you to reduce your emissions so they can achieve their targets. A lot of these companies are offering support in greenhouse gas accounting and target setting and co-investing in renewable energy or energy efficiency measures. So there may be support out there from customers or others along your value chain, various
Thanks.
collaborations that are out there right now.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think that's great. And it really is a nice transition to two other things I want to talk about in the next 5 minutes or so about this kind of relationship between companies on setting SBTs and the way Scope 3 plays out. So one of them is around the value chain, especially in the sort of food and agriculture space. At Chatham, one of the companies that we work with is Marburger Farm Dairy. Their biggest, they're a big supplier for Walmart. Walmart has set a science-based target. That means they're in the middle of trying to figure out how they do something similar for itself. But Eric, I know you've done a decent amount of work, and you and your colleagues at BSR thinking about the way agriculture and land and food play out in this in this world. So could you say a little bit more about that on the supply chain side?
Yeah, thanks. And Lou, how's my sound? Am I all right?
You sound great, and you look great. Like that picture, like with the fence behind you, that's amazing.
This is California when the wind is blowing.
Game.
This is California when the wind is blowing in a friendly direction. This picture can change very quickly, I'll just say. So thank you very much, and thanks all for your comments. Just want to reemphasize some things that a few of my friends have said here. I think what both David and Cynthia in particular have mentioned on the opportunities to partner with others becomes critically important when we get into small, medium size, and I would argue profoundly important when we're talking about a supply chain like food and agriculture. And this sector, perhaps more than any other, is really testing our ability to make this work practical, even inspiring, for a lot of good people who don't have a lot of time or spend a lot of time thinking about things like climate change, but they certainly care about the future of their families and their operations and other things like that. So what we found in food is some of the solutions. First thing to note is when a big company, and I've personally done this with Walmart, with General Mills, with some of the others, when they make one of these big commitments, easily 80% of the commitment they're making is really their suppliers taking action. And that is not lost on the suppliers, who then turn and say, well, thank you very much, guys. Did you think about how we're going to do that with you? Right? Because the tons and a lot of the action is at farm level, a huge percentage. So on the one hand, you've got the transportation support groups that David was mentioning. There are collaborations that you can reach out to help with trucking, help with other pieces. When it comes to farm practices, we found a similar opportunity for folks up the chain to band together. And sometimes that's by commodity, sometimes it's by issue area. But the point is, one of the most helpful things that we have in this is it's going to take us a long time in general to get farmers excited about fighting climate change. And there's no reason for us to insist on that language or our frameworks or any of those pieces. On the other hand, if we're talking about the productivity of farmland, if we're talking about the health and productivity of soil, if we're talking about water, they've been worried about this for decades. They're way ahead of us. Good news is that 80% of the things that we need to happen in ag for climate reasons are good for water, are good for the productivity of the soil. So all of this has been about pivoting our programs, helping the likes of Walmart provide assistance upstream to suppliers who want to take action in areas like ag, engaging in different ways with USDA and other programs to say, how do we make this real for what ultimately is thousands and thousands of family-owned and slightly larger operations that have got to do things differently and stay in business in a really tough business. The good news is that is happening. It does require engagement, and that I don't know a cheat for. Yes, the tools have to be easier for smaller enterprises, but other people will tell our story if we're not engaging and telling it ourselves. So we have no choice, regardless of where we are in the supply chain, to understand where our impact is, identify the 1, 2, or 3 things we can do. It may not be perfect, but it's pretty good. And then we got to be talking to and partnering with people we haven't worked with before and take action. Then we can do it. So I'll hold myself there.
So that's great, Eric. And I think picking up on a theme, right? And David mentioned this too. Cynthia alluded to this. The way in which we're starting to see more cooperation, more of that business to business cooperation to try to build capacity, whether it's the new trade associations, like the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance that you and I worked on, or the Renewable Thermal Collaborative that David mentioned, these partnerships between big companies and their suppliers to build capacity. And then, Matt, this is something you've had your hands in just earlier this year, right? Trying to bring over 150 companies within the supply chains of, some of those bigger brands. Can you say a little bit more about that cooperative piece and how it's been playing out in your world?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Lou, and thanks, Sustainable Pittsburgh. Thanks, colleagues on the call. We have always said as a team of strategists that are counseling big brands on these issues, whether it's food, beverage, pharma, apparel, tech, transport, retail, real estate, that sustainability is a team sport. And at its best, it's a partnership. So we convened a roundtable in Philadelphia when we saw a weird thing happening. So we had the Science Based Targets Initiative pushing companies to set goals to address their supply chain in addition to their operations. And yet the sustainability managers didn't really have it in their mandate to take on suppliers. And so while they got the goals approved in their senior management team, they hadn't really done a lot of thinking about how to engage the procurement side of the business, the supply chain side of the business, and they didn't even have the relationships in those functions of the company. So we invited 6 brands to the Philadelphia Navy Yard and sat them down. This was Mars, PepsiCo, McCormick, Johnson & Johnson, PVH in the apparel sector, along with WWF and the Food Marketing Institute. So we had pharma, food, apparel, and a couple of trade groups. And we basically had them map out their supply chains on the wall and think about where could they have the most impact from an emissions perspective and where could they work together. And there were really 4 categories that showed up. So ingredients, packaging, transportation, and contract manufacturers. And basically started building month by month, even into the pandemic, a design solution for those suppliers. And it actually works for any kind of supplier. So it's a training initiative. It also has significant behavior science built into it. So the suppliers work through 2 tracks. One's on footprinting, one's on target setting. They take a seminar every month. And at the beginning, they get a climate maturity score. And at the end, they actually get a badge like you would see with LEED. So there's green, bronze, silver, and gold. We're even looking at platinum if they're high performers. And so we launched that behind the scenes in January, more publicly in March, and then did a press release in April. And on the day that we did the press release, we got 500 media hits. So now it's going to triple in size in October. And so that's kind of where things are with that.
Thanks. Thanks, Matt. And
that's the story there.
Yeah, no, and I think just, again, we're just seeing more of this and more of it being driven really just directly by those companies, those bigger companies that have taken these targets and realize they can't actually just leave their suppliers out to dry on this, or else they won't meet their own targets, right? So it creates that set of incentives that are driving some cooperation. I also wanted, Matt, so we have you talking, to say a little bit about the way communicating, the role that companies are are finding for their communications and their voice in this space. And for a long time, we've largely seen that in the form of CSR reports, but that's beginning to change, it seems to me. And I wonder if you could just say a minute or so about that.
Yeah, I mean, this whole dynamic has really shifted. The stakeholders companies kind of have to engage now is myriad. It's NGOs, it's local, regional, state, national, international government, it's investors, it's investor relations internally, it's the public, it's customers, it's suppliers, it's consumers. But I want to talk about the investor piece for a second. So you may have heard that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, issued this letter to 200 CEOs, and he's done it twice now. Well, that really changed the dynamic in the financial arena. McDonald's board in particular has said that letter got more attention than anything that's come across their desk in the last 2 decades. So it really piqued the interest of a lot of boards. And so, some of our counterparts are now announcing their goals on their investor calls exclusively. So they're actually announcing their new climate plan, to investors first and prioritizing investors above any other audience. And then you have the interest of millennials. And in particular, one thing that we've seen is a pivot toward millennial moms as a demographic. In particularly, they pull more interested in this topic than just about any other demographic. And they're 90 million strong. They have the most spend power of any demographic in the market, in the consumer market. And they're a generation that will have had this on their mind since kindergarten, because they've had a lot of this, depending upon where they live in the country, in their education for a long time. They also want to support brands that support their values, and this shows up in an important Goldman Sachs report about that demographic. And they want to do business with brands that understand what matters. So we see companies doing a lot more what I would call PR blitz type efforts, now that when they have their climate plan, than anything I've seen in the past. And I've been working on this issue since 2002, when I joined Climate Savers. And then, the last thing is really the changing government dynamic. I mean, the Biden bounce, or if you want to call it, sort of the societal shift that happened at the beginning of this year. We will see the Security and Exchange Commission expecting companies to disclose more on climate change in their 10K filings, based on messages that we've heard from the head of that agency. And that will be another nudge for transparency, disclosure, and action beyond kind of the era of pledging. I think the era of pledging is over. That was the last decade, and the next decade, we're now officially in the implementation phase. And we should be. Pledging had its purpose, but now it's time for implementation. And, again, the IPCC report, alarm bells, red alert, it's an emergency. If we don't get moving soon, we're going to run out of time.
Great. I mean, not great, but thanks. Really bad, actually. That's the bad part. But thanks, Matt. And I think thanks for sort of leading us into kind of the last big topic that we wanted to talk about a little bit, and that is sort of policy and what that means for companies. Like we're in Pennsylvania, folks. We're in Western Pennsylvania. We're in the swingiest part of the swingiest state. So politics around climate change and even other sustainability issues can be fraught. But we know we need the policy players to get into the game if we're going to meet some of this net zero kind of societal target that Cynthia was talking about. David, I want to get back to you and see if you could speak to a little bit of the way you see the trend. You were talking about the trend as it related to sort of company direct action. Can you speak a little bit about the trend as it relates to policy engagement?
Absolutely, Lou. I think, fortunately, the trend of policy engagement is up. I think that's driven by two sorts of things. I mean, as you've heard from our presenters earlier, many of the companies that are adopting targets are buying into the notion that climate change, they're doing it because climate change is a real problem and they believe it needs to be solved. And you can't solve climate change without policy. So I think lots of companies and other institutions are engaging for that reason. The other reason that I think, and this really ties back to how Cynthia has been describing the Science-Based Target Initiative, is that lots of people are understanding they can't meet their own targets without having policy change. And so there's a, frankly, somewhat self-interested maneuver here too, in addition to the altruistic one. So for example, as I think you know from your work and yours and Eric's work on renewable electricity, at the beginning, the utility industry was not interested in offering companies and other institutions renewable electricity, and I participated in meetings at which they tried to talk companies out of this. Today, as we think about how do we scale that up, not every company, like some of the really big ones, can do a power purchase agreement. Clearly, kind of getting to scale, that you've got to do that in part by engaging in the policymaking process within your own state to say, is your utility delivering that kind of activity? Another big barrier, I think, for people is that a lot of the technologies that we want to install simply are more expensive than the conventional technology. Well, again, in electricity, we've demonstrated that government policy can lower the price of wind and solar so that it's incredibly competitive. And so I think we see, for example, in our Renewable Thermal Collaborative, a lot of the companies engaging and saying, look, we need research and development by government, we need tax incentives, we need other incentives for utilities to drive the development of cheaper technologies. And then the third category that I think is definitely out there is the whole one, we're in the midst of a national debate about infrastructure. Well, we're not going to electrify fleets if we don't have adequate charging infrastructure in a lot of different places, whether that's for passenger vehicles or trucks. Most of our wind and solar energy gets generated in the middle of the country where there aren't that many either businesses or people. We need transmission line that's going to move it from the middle of the country to where electricity demand actually exists. Over the longer term, are we going to see, I think we'll see decarbonized fuels, and we may need pipeline infrastructure upgraded to be able to deliver that. Those are all policy issues. And I see lots and lots of companies and other institutions engaging now because they see government intervention and policy as critical to helping them achieve their own objectives.
Thanks, David, and really connecting the dots for us with this conversation about the role of cooperative corporate sort of implementation, right? And in fact, the more you're starting to bring those companies together, whether it's in the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and it is becoming clear as companies do that strategizing together about how you get to reach these goals that you can't get there. So it's instead of, I think, maybe in the past where it was like civil society or maybe the public saying companies need to raise their voice, there's still that, and I think that still has a role, but you're seeing more of that kind of sui generis from within the corporate side saying, oh, we got to be smart about how we engage, but we got to engage on some of these policy matters. So I want to do a speed round to wrap this up. And we really only have time for everybody to do their one sentence. I told you ahead of time, one sentence. What's your one piece of advice for those here on the call that are in the trenches trying to drive sustainability reporting and action inside their company? What's your one piece of advice? Jana, back to you.
We've talked a lot about the interests of the stakeholders, but I think it's important for organizations to understand that there's business value in sustainability and carbon reduction. And so you're doing this for the sake of your own business as well. So the things like, operating cost reduction, energy cost reduction, opportunities from a revenue standpoint with some of the innovations, and the collaborations with customers, suppliers, and peers, competitors is how we'll get it done.
Awesome, thanks. A lot of semicolons in that sentence. Eric, go.
Identify the one maximum two things that you think that you can do to both improve the economics and climate profile of your business, and find friends to help you make it happen.
Thank you. Matt Banks.
All right. Use the climate productivity portfolio. The team that Lou and I led developed it. It shows 5 elements: ambitious targets, investing in energy management, investing in renewables, low greenhouse gas products and supply chains, engaging stakeholders in government. These are the 5 ingredients for a thorough climate plan. And if you don't have all 5, you don't have a comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Matt. David.
I'm with Eric. Find your friends and collaborate, and especially do so on policy.
I'm muted. Okay. Cynthia, you're going to have to really pull a strong one to beat David. I'm giving David the A.
I could go in so many directions. I have like 5 different ones written down, but all right, I'm gonna, mine kind of echoes with Jana was saying. Instead of thinking about the costs of reducing emissions, focus on the risks of not reducing emissions. And one way or another, there is going to be a higher cost through reputational risks, physical risks, regulatory risks. So there will be higher costs of greenhouse gas emissions in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. As those of you who are here could tell, we could go on with this group. It's such a great group. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks to all of you who brought questions to us. That's how we came up with this panel. So let's keep that flow of information going. And Gina, back to you to wrap us up.
Thanks all. What an incredible panel. What an amazing lineup of presenters. We so appreciate you sharing your expertise today and being with us. Lou, thanks for partnering with us on this, the Chatham University's Fox School. We are grateful to you all. Thanks for those who are in attendance today. We want to thank our sponsors for making this event possible, UPMC Health Plan, Covestro, and the Pittsburgh Pirates. And just to wrap it up, we invite you to join us. Find more information at sustainablepittsburgh.org. We are looking to connect you with your friends to make progress on these goals, and look forward to working with you in the future. So please visit us and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks all.